The Don who forced his daughter into the convent, then turned it into an exclusive brothel for judges, Chicago, 1928. On November 3, 1928, Chicago Fire Department Battalion Chief Raymond Kowalski responded to a 3-alarm blaze at the Convent of the Sacred Wounds on North Halsted Street. The fire had started in the basement and spread through the ventilation system with unusual speed. When firefighters finally contained the blaze and entered the structure, they found something that would haunt Kowalski for the rest of his life. Behind a false wall in what should have been the Mother Superior's private chapel, they discovered a series of rooms decorated in red velvet and gold brocade. There were 7 bedrooms, each with a brass nameplate on the door. The nameplates bore no names, only initials and dates. In the largest room, investigators found a leather-bound ledger locked inside a fireproof safe. The ledger contained entries spanning 4 years, each recording a date, a set of initials, and a sum of money. Beside each entry, written in a different hand, was a single word in Latin, confiteor, I confess. The ledger also contained photographs, not of faces, but of hands. Judicial hands. Hands wearing distinctive rings, the kind given to Cook County judges upon their appointment to the bench. In one photograph, a hand rested on an ornate Bible. In another, the same hand held a gavel. The photographs were dated and cross-referenced to the ledger entries. At the bottom of the final page, someone had written in careful script, "The law kneels here." This is not a story about prostitution disguised as piety. This is a story about how a man weaponized his daughter's faith to build a cathedral of corruption, and how the men who were supposed to uphold justice became the architects of their own damnation. This is a story about the precise moment when devotion becomes complicity, and how institutions designed to protect the innocent can become machines that devour them. Before we continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I want to know who's listening to this story, because what happened in Chicago in 1928 didn't stay in Chicago. The patterns we're about to explore, the intersection of faith, power, and corruption, they're still operating today, just wearing different masks. To understand how a convent became a brothel for judges, we must go back to a bitter February in 1901, to a tenement on the near west side, where Salvatore the penitent Abruzzo was born during a blizzard that killed 17 people in Chicago. His mother, Francesca, was a seamstress who made wedding dresses for wealthy families on the Gold Coast. His father, Giuseppe, was a stone mason who helped build some of Chicago's most beautiful churches. Giuseppe died when Salvatore was 7 years old, crushed beneath a falling scaffold at Holy Name Cathedral. Francesca raised Salvatore alone, working 16-hour days, her fingers bleeding from needle pricks, her eyes failing from close work in dim light. Salvatore was an altar boy at Our Lady of Pompeii Church. He served at morning mass every day before school, learned Latin from Father Domenico Caruso, and told his mother he wanted to become a priest. Francesca saved every penny she could spare, dreaming of the day her son would celebrate his first mass. But in 1916, when Salvatore was 15, Francesca contracted tuberculosis. The disease ravaged her lungs. She died in a charity ward at Cook County Hospital, alone, because Salvatore was at school and couldn't afford to miss a day of work at the stockyards where he'd taken a job to pay for her medicine. At her funeral, Salvatore knelt beside the casket for 6 hours. Witnesses said he didn't weep, he didn't pray. He simply stared at her face, his lips moving silently. When Father Caruso finally approached him and said, "She's with God now, my son," Salvatore looked up and said, "God let her die alone in a room that smelled like piss and carbolic acid." God let her fingers bleed for rich women who never knew her name. Where was God when she needed him? He never went back to church, not as a supplicant. But he never stopped thinking about God either. What he began to think about was leverage. By 1918, Salvatore Abruzzo had joined the crew of Antonio the Gentleman Lombardo, one of the most sophisticated bootleggers in Chicago. Lombardo wasn't like the other mob bosses. He didn't believe in violence for its own sake. He believed in systems. He believed in making people need you, then making them grateful for the privilege of your service. Lombardo taught Salvatore that the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun. It was obligation. Make a man owe you something he can never repay, and you own him forever. Salvatore learned quickly. He was smart, disciplined, and utterly without sentiment. By 1920, he was running his own crew. By 1922, he controlled most of the bootlegging operations on the Near West Side. And by 1924, he had earned his nickname, the Penitent. Not because he felt remorse, he never did, but because he had discovered something profound. The men who ran Chicago, the judges, the aldermen, the police captains, the prosecutors, they all carried guilt. They all had secrets. They all needed absolution. And Salvatore Abruzzo understood that the confessional was the most powerful room in the world. In 1923, Salvatore married Giuliana Rossetti, the daughter of a wealthy importer. It was a strategic marriage. Giuliana's father controlled the shipping docks. The marriage gave Salvatore legitimacy and access, but it also gave him something he hadn't expected: a daughter. Lucia Abruzzo was born in February 1924, during another blizzard, almost exactly 23 years after her father's birth. Salvatore held her in the hospital and felt something he hadn't felt since his mother died. Not love, exactly. Something more complicated. A sense of purpose that transcended profit. He decided in that moment that Lucia would be his masterpiece. She would be everything his mother had wanted him to be. She would be pure. She would be devoted. She would be a bride of Christ. And through her, he would build something that would make him untouchable. Lucia grew up in a mansion on Astor Street. She had tutors, music lessons, French governesses. She attended Mass every morning at Holy Name Cathedral, the same cathedral where her grandfather had died. She was a quiet, serious child who read the lives of the saints and asked her father questions about suffering and redemption. Salvatore encouraged this. He bought her books about Teresa of Avila and Catherine of Siena. He told her stories about martyrs who had given everything for God. He told her that faith was the only thing in the world that couldn't be bought or corrupted. He was lying, of course. But Lucia believed him. When Lucia was 12 years old, Salvatore took her to visit the Convent of the Sacred Wounds on North Halsted Street. The convent was small, poor, and struggling. The nuns who lived there were mostly elderly, and the building was falling apart. The Mother Superior, Sister Agatha Kowalski, was a stern woman in her 70s who had dedicated her life to caring for orphans and the destitute. Salvatore made a generous donation to the convent. Then he made another, then another. Within a year, he was the convent's primary benefactor. He paid for a new roof. He paid for new plumbing. He paid for renovations to the chapel. He paid for everything. And Sister Agatha, who had spent her entire life in poverty, who had watched children die from preventable diseases because there was no money for medicine, who had prayed every night for a miracle. Sister Agatha was grateful. In 1926, when Lucia was 14, Salvatore told her that God had spoken to him in a dream. God had told him that Lucia was called to be a nun. Lucia, who had been raised to believe that her father was a devout man, who had been taught that obedience was the highest virtue, who had read about saints who had defied their families to follow God's call. Lucia believed him. She entered the Convent of the Sacred Wounds in September 1926, 2 months before her 15th birthday. What followed was a masterpiece of psychological architecture. Salvatore didn't simply abandon his daughter to the convent. He visited her every week. He attended Mass with her. He prayed with her. He told her how proud he was of her devotion. He told her that she was doing God's work. He told her that through her prayers, she was saving souls. And then, slowly, carefully, he began to rebuild the convent. The renovations started in the basement. Salvatore told Sister Agatha that he wanted to create a meditation space for the nuns, a quiet place where they could pray undisturbed. He hired contractors, men from his own crew, and they worked at night when the nuns were asleep. They built a separate entrance that opened onto an alley. They installed soundproofing. They created a series of rooms that were accessible only through a hidden door in the Mother Superior's chapel. Sister Agatha never saw these rooms. She was told they were storage spaces for the convent's supplies. She believed this because she wanted to believe it, because Salvatore Abruzzo had saved her convent, because he had saved the children she cared for, because he was a good man who loved his daughter and loved God. In January 1927, Salvatore invited Judge Harold Whitmore to dinner at his home. Whitmore was a Cook County Circuit Court judge, a man known for his integrity and his harsh sentences for bootleggers. He had sent 3 of Salvatore's associates to prison. Salvatore served him a meal prepared by a French chef. They drank wine from Salvatore's private collection. They talked about philosophy, about justice, about the nature of law. And then Salvatore said, "Your Honor, I know you're a man of principle. I respect that. But I also know you're a man who carries burdens. We all do. The question is, where do we put them down?" Whitmore stiffened. He said, "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Abruzzo, but I think it's time I left." Salvatore smiled. He said, "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm offering you something. A place where men like you, men who bear the weight of judgment, can find peace. A place where you can confess your burdens without fear of exposure. A place where you can be absolved." He handed Whitmore a card. On it was an address: the Convent of the Sacred Wounds. Below the address was a time: 9 p.m., Thursday. Below the time was a single word: Confidier. Whitmore looked at the card for a long moment. Then he put it in his pocket and left without another word. On Thursday night, Judge Harold Whitmore arrived at the convent at 9 o'clock. He entered through the alley door. He was met by a woman wearing a nun's habit. She led him down a hallway lit by candles. She opened a door. Inside was a room decorated in red velvet and gold brocade. There was a bed, a chair, a small table with wine and bread. On the wall hung a crucifix. The woman removed her habit. She was young, beautiful, and utterly silent. She poured him wine. She sat beside him. She listened as he talked about his wife, who no longer touched him, about his daughter, who had died of influenza, about the men he had sentenced to death, and the nights he woke up hearing their voices. She didn't judge him. She didn't speak. She simply listened. And when he was finished talking, she took his hand and led him to the bed. Afterward, she knelt beside him and said, "You are forgiven." He wept. When he left, he placed an envelope on the table. Inside was $500 and a note for the orphans. Judge Whitmore returned the following week, and the week after that, and the week after that. Within 6 months, Salvatore Abruzzo had recruited 7 judges to his convent. Each one believed he was the only one, Each one believed he was engaged in a private act of confession and absolution. Each one paid generously for the privilege, and each one, without realizing it, was being photographed. The cameras were hidden in the crucifixes on the walls. The photographs captured hands, rings, distinctive scars, and birthmarks. They never showed faces. They didn't need to. The rings were enough. Salvatore kept the photographs in the fireproof safe, along with the ledger. He never showed them to the judges. He never threatened them. He didn't need to. The judges knew on some level what they were doing. They knew they were compromised. They knew they were owned. But they kept coming back, because the alternative, facing their guilt without absolution, was unbearable. And Salvatore Abruzzo, who had watched his mother die alone in a charity ward, who had knelt beside her casket and cursed God, who had spent his entire adult life building systems of obligation and control, Salvatore Abruzzo had finally found his cathedral. But he had also made a miscalculation. He had assumed that Lucia, sheltered within the convent walls, would never discover what he had built beneath her feet. He had assumed that her faith would keep her blind. He was wrong. In March 1928, Lucia Abruzzo was 17 years old. She had been living in the convent for 18 months. She had taken her first vows. She spent her days in prayer, in study, in service to the orphans who lived in the convent's care. She was, by all accounts, a model novice, devout, obedient, serene. But Lucia was also her father's daughter. She was observant. She was intelligent. And she had begun to notice things. She noticed that her father's visits had become more frequent. She noticed that he spent long periods of time alone with Sister Agatha. She noticed that the convent, which had once been on the verge of collapse, now had more money than it needed. She noticed that certain rooms in the basement were always locked, and that her father carried a key she had never seen before. And she noticed the women. They arrived at night, always through the alley entrance. They wore nuns' habits, but they moved differently than the real nuns. They walked with a kind of practiced grace, a deliberate sensuality that seemed out of place in a house of God. Lucia watched them from her window. She counted them. There were 7. One night in late March, Lucia followed one of the women. She waited until the convent was silent, until the other nuns were asleep, and then she crept down the stairs to the basement. She heard voices, low, male voices, coming from behind the wall of the Mother Superior's chapel. She pressed her ear against the wall and listened. She heard laughter. She heard the clink of glasses. She heard a man say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." And then more laughter. She found the hidden door by accident. She was running her hands along the wall, searching for the source of the voices, when her fingers caught on a small brass latch disguised as a decorative cross. She pulled it. The door swung open. What she saw in those rooms destroyed her. She saw the beds, the velvet, the gold brocade. She saw the wine, the candles, the crucifixes on the walls. She saw a man she recognized as Judge Harold Whitmore, a man whose photograph had been in the newspaper, a man who had sentenced bootleggers to death. She saw him lying in bed with one of the women, his judicial ring glinting in the candlelight. She ran. She didn't confront her father. She didn't tell Sister Agatha. She ran to her cell and locked the door and knelt before the small wooden crucifix on her wall and prayed. She prayed for hours. She prayed until her knees bled. She prayed for understanding, for guidance, for a sign from God. But God was silent. The next morning, Lucia went to her father. She told him what she had seen. She asked him to explain. She wanted to believe there was an explanation. She wanted to believe that her father, who had told her that faith was the only thing that couldn't be corrupted, who had encouraged her vocation, who had built this convent. She wanted to believe he was still the man she thought he was. Salvatore looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he said, "Lucia, do you know what those men are?" She shook her head. He said, "They're judges. They're the men who decide who goes to prison and who goes free. They're the men who hold the power of life and death. And they come here because they need something they can't get anywhere else. They need forgiveness. They need to put down their burdens. And we give them that. We give them a place where they can be human." Lucia said, "But it's a sin. What they're doing, what you're doing, it's a sin." Salvatore smiled. He said, "Is it? Or is it mercy? Those women, they're not being forced. They're being paid more than they could earn anywhere else. They're being protected. They're being cared for. And those men, they're not being corrupted. They're already corrupted. We're just giving them a place to confess it. We're giving them absolution." Lucia said, "That's not absolution. That's blasphemy." Salvatore's smile faded. He said, "Lucia, you're my daughter. You're the only thing in this world I love. But you're also a child. You don't understand how the world works. You don't understand that faith without power is just weakness. You don't understand that God doesn't save people. People save people. And sometimes to save people, you have to give them what they need, even if it's a sin." He stood up. He walked to the window. He said, "You have a choice, Lucia. You can accept what I've built here. You can understand that this convent, your convent, exists because of what happens in those rooms. The orphans you care for, the nuns you pray with, the roof over your head. All of it exists because those judges come here and pay for their absolution. Or you can reject it. You can leave. You can go out into the world and try to survive on faith alone. But I promise you, the world will break you. Just like it broke your grandmother." Lucia didn't leave. She didn't accept it either. She stayed in the convent, but she stopped speaking to her father. She stopped attending the masses he came to. She spent her days in the chapel, praying, weeping, trying to reconcile what she had seen with what she had been taught to believe. And then, on the night of November 2nd, 1928, Lucia Abruzzo made a decision. She went down to the basement. She waited until the convent was silent. She opened the hidden door. She walked through the rooms one by one, and she looked at everything her father had built. She looked at the beds, the velvet, the gold. She looked at the crucifixes on the walls, and she understood, finally, what they were. They weren't symbols of faith. They were cameras. They were tools of blackmail. They were instruments of control. She found the safe. She didn't know the combination, but she knew where her father kept his keys. She had watched him all her life, and she knew his habits. She found the key in his coat pocket. She opened the safe. She took out the ledger. She took out the photographs. And then she set fire to the room. She used the candles. She lit the velvet drapes first, then the bedding, then the wooden furniture. She watched the flames spread. She stood in the center of the room and watched everything burn. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, holding the ledger and the photographs, and watched her father's cathedral collapse. The fire spread faster than she expected. The ventilation system carried the smoke and flames through the building. By the time the nuns woke up and realized what was happening, the entire basement was engulfed. They evacuated the orphans. They called the fire department. They searched for Lucia. They never found her. When the firefighters finally contained the blaze and entered the basement, they found the hidden rooms. They found the safe. they found the ledger and the photographs. Lucia had placed them back in the safe before the flames reached it, as if she wanted them to survive, as if she wanted the truth to be discovered. But they never found Lucia's body. The investigation that followed was swift and quiet. The photographs were examined, the judges were identified, but no charges were ever filed. The Cook County State's attorney, himself a client of Salvatore Abruzzo, though not of the convent, declared that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. The ledger was sealed. The photographs were locked away. The official report stated that the fire had been caused by faulty wiring. Sister Agatha died 3 months later. The coroner said it was a heart attack, but the nuns who cared for her in her final days said she never spoke again after the fire. She simply lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her lips moving in silent prayer. Salvatore Abruzzo was never charged with any crime. He continued to operate his bootlegging empire until Prohibition ended. He died in 1952 in his mansion on Astor Street, surrounded by wealth and power. His funeral was attended by judges, aldermen, and police captains. The eulogy praised him as a philanthropist and a devoted father. But in the weeks before he died, Salvatore told a story to his personal physician, Dr. Emil Kowalski, the son of Battalion Chief Raymond Kowalski, the man who had first discovered the hidden rooms. Dr. Kowalski recorded the conversation in his private journal, which was discovered after his own death in 1979. According to Dr. Kowalski's journal, Salvatore said this: "3 days after the fire, I received a letter. It had no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, Lucia had written, 'I have taken the ledger and the photographs to a place where they can never be used to hurt anyone again. I have taken myself to the same place. You taught me that faith without power is weakness, but you were wrong. Faith without power is freedom. I am free now, and you will never be.'" Salvatore told Dr. Kowalski that he had searched for Lucia for years. He had hired private investigators. He had called in favors from every judge, every cop, every politician he owned. He had offered rewards. He had threatened people. He had done everything in his power to find her. But Lucia Abruzzo was never seen again. In 1955, a nun at a convent in New Mexico wrote to the Archdiocese of Chicago. She said that a young woman had arrived at their convent in November 1928, claiming to be a refugee from a fire. The woman had taken final vows under the name Sister Maria Penitentia. She had lived at the convent for 27 years, caring for the sick and the dying. She had never spoken about her past. She had died peacefully in her sleep in 1955, at the age of 48. The nun who wrote the letter said that Sister Maria Penitentia had left behind a single possession, a leather-bound ledger filled with names, dates, and the word confiteor. 13. Nun asked if the Archdiocese wanted the ledger returned. The Archdiocese sent a representative to New Mexico. He examined the ledger. He confirmed that it matched the description of the ledger found in the safe after the fire. But when he compared the entries, he discovered something strange. The ledger from New Mexico contained all the same entries as the original, but it also contained new entries. Entries dated after the fire. Entries that recorded the names of judges who had never been clients of Salvatore Abruzzo. Entries that seemed to document an entirely different operation. The representative brought the ledger back to Chicago. It was examined by experts. They determined that the new entries were written in the same hand as the original entries, Lucia's hand. But they couldn't explain how she had obtained the information. They couldn't explain how she had known about judges she had never met, in cities she had never visited. The ledger was sealed. It was placed in the Archdiocese archives with a note: "Do not catalogue, do not investigate," sealed by order of Cardinal Mundelein. It remains there today. In 1973, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune named Margaret Halloran began investigating the fire at the Convent of the Sacred Wounds. She had heard rumors about the hidden rooms, about the judges, about the ledger. She filed Freedom of Information requests. She interviewed retired firefighters. She tracked down relatives of the nuns who had lived at the convent. And then, in November 1973, exactly 45 years after the fire, she received a letter. It had no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it was written, "The law kneels here. It always has. It always will." Some truths are not meant to be reported. Some fires are not meant to be extinguished. Go home, Margaret. Pray for your soul. Margaret Halloran stopped her investigation. She never wrote the story. When asked about it years later, she would only say, "Some stories are too dangerous to tell." Not because of what they reveal about the past, but because of what they reveal about the present. The Convent of the Sacred Wounds was demolished in 1960. The land was sold to a developer who built a parking garage. The garage still stands today. People who park there sometimes report strange occurrences. They smell incense and smoke. They hear women singing hymns in Latin. They see shadows moving in the stairwells, shadows that look like women in nuns' habits. And sometimes, late at night, they find small cards tucked under their windshield wipers. The cards are blank except for a single word in Latin: confiteor. I confess. The question that haunts this story is not what happened to Lucia Abruzzo. The question is what she understood that her father never did. Salvatore believed that faith without power was weakness. He believed that to save people, you had to control them. He believed that absolution could be bought and sold like any other commodity. But Lucia understood something deeper. She understood that true absolution doesn't come from confession. It comes from renunciation. It comes from walking away from power, from wealth, from control. It comes from choosing freedom over safety, truth over comfort, faith over certainty. Salvatore Abruzzo built a cathedral of corruption. He weaponized his daughter's faith to create a system that turned judges into penitents and penitents into slaves. He believed he was offering mercy, but what he was really offering was a gilded cage, a place where powerful men could kneel and weep and feel forgiven without ever having to change. And Lucia burned it down. She burned it down not because she hated her father, but because she loved God more than she loved him. She burned it down not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted freedom. She burned it down and walked away, and in walking away, she became the thing her father could never be: truly penitent. The ledger in the Archdiocese archives, the one with the entries that shouldn't exist, the entries that document judges and sins that Lucia couldn't possibly have known about. That ledger is either a forgery, a coincidence, or something else entirely. Something that suggests Lucia didn't just walk away from her father's system. She built a new one. A system not of control, but of witness. A system that recorded sins not to blackmail sinners, but to remember them. To testify. To say, this happened. These men did these things, and someone was watching. Or maybe the ledger is exactly what it appears to be. A record kept by a woman who spent 27 years in a convent in New Mexico, praying for the souls of men she had never met. Men who knelt in rooms she had never seen. Men who paid for absolution they would never receive. Maybe Lucia Abruzzo spent the rest of her life doing what her father never could, offering real forgiveness. Not the kind you buy, the kind you earn through witness, through prayer, through the slow, painful work of holding someone's sin in your heart and refusing to let it destroy you. Or maybe she spent the rest of her life doing something else entirely. Maybe she became a different kind of architect. Maybe she built a network of women in convents across the country, who listened to confessions and kept records and waited for the day when the truth could finally be told, when the ledgers could finally be opened, when the men who knelt in those rooms would finally have to face not just their guilt, but their complicity. We'll never know. The ledger is sealed, the witnesses are dead, the convent is gone, but the cards still appear. Confiteor, I confess, and the question remains, what are we confessing? Our sins or our silence? Our guilt or our willingness to be forgiven without changing? Our faith or our fear? Salvatore Abruzzo believed he could build a system that would make him untouchable. He believed he could weaponize faith, commodify absolution, and control the very men who were supposed to uphold justice. And for a time, he succeeded. He built his cathedral. He filled it with penitents. He made the law kneel. But in the end, his cathedral burned. And his daughter, the daughter he had tried to make into a symbol of purity, a tool of control, a living testament to his power, his daughter walked away. She walked into the desert. She took his secrets with her, and she spent the rest of her life doing the one thing he could never do. She forgave him, not by excusing what he had done, not by pretending it hadn't happened, but by choosing every day to carry the weight of his sin without letting it crush her, by choosing to live in a way that testified to a different kind of power, the power of renunciation, the power of witness, the power of a faith that doesn't need control to survive. The law still kneels. In courtrooms across this country, judges still make decisions that serve power instead of justice. Prosecutors still cut deals with criminals who have the right connections. Defense attorneys still protect clients who can afford to buy their silence. The system Salvatore Abruzzo exploited, the system that allows wealth and influence to corrupt justice, that system is still operating. It's just wearing different masks. And somewhere, in archives and safe deposit boxes and locked filing cabinets, there are ledgers. Ledgers that record who paid whom and for what. Ledgers that document the sins of powerful men. Ledgers that wait like time bombs for the moment when someone decides to open them. Maybe that someone will be like Lucia. Maybe they'll choose to walk away, to renounce the power those ledgers represent, to spend their lives in prayer and witness and forgiveness. Or maybe they'll choose to burn it all down. The fire at the Convent of the Sacred Wounds burned for 6 hours. It took 40 firefighters to contain it. The smoke could be seen from the loop. People said it looked like the smoke from a funeral pyre, like something ancient and necessary, like a cleansing. But fires don't cleanse. They only reveal. They burn away the facade and show you what was always there underneath. And what was underneath the Convent of the Sacred Wounds was a simple, terrible truth. That faith can be weaponized. That devotion can be exploited. That the institutions we build to protect the innocent can become the very machines that devour them. And that sometimes the only way to stop the machine is to burn it down and walk away. Lucia Abruzzo walked away. She walked into the desert. She took a new name. She lived a quiet life. She cared for the sick and the dying. She prayed. And when she died, she left behind a ledger that shouldn't exist. A ledger that suggests she spent 27 years doing something we can barely imagine. Bearing witness to sins she never saw. Offering forgiveness to men she never met. holding the weight of her father's corruption without letting it define her. Or maybe the ledger is a forgery. Maybe it's a myth. Maybe Lucia Abruzzo died in the fire, and everything that came after. The letter to her father, the nun in New Mexico, the sealed ledger in the archives. Maybe it's all just a story we tell ourselves because we need to believe that someone escaped, that someone chose freedom over power, that someone walked away. But whether the story is true or not, the question it asks is real. Can you walk away from a system you were born into? Can you renounce the power that was given to you? Can you choose faith over certainty, freedom over safety, truth over comfort? Can you burn down your father's cathedral and still forgive him? Lucia Abruzzo answered yes, or at least the story says she did, and maybe that's enough. Maybe the truth of the story isn't whether it happened exactly as we tell it. Maybe the truth of the story is that we need it to have happened. We need to believe that someone, somewhere, made the choice to walk away, to renounce, to forgive. Because if Lucia could do it, if she could walk away from wealth and power and control, if she could spend 27 years in a desert convent praying for the souls of men who had knelt in her father's cathedral, if she could die peacefully in her sleep after a life of service and witness and forgiveness, then maybe we can do it too. Maybe we can walk away from the systems that corrupt us. Maybe we can renounce the power we've been given. Maybe we can choose to bear witness instead of seeking revenge. Maybe we can forgive without excusing. Maybe we can build something new. Or maybe we can't. Maybe the system is too strong. Maybe the corruption runs too deep. Maybe the ledgers will stay sealed forever, and the men who kneel in those rooms will never face justice, and the fires will keep burning, and the smoke will keep rising, and nothing will ever change. But the cards still appear. Confiture, I confess. And as long as they appear, the question remains open. The story remains unfinished. The fire still burns. What will you do when you find the card under your windshield wiper? Will you throw it away? Will you ignore it? Will you pretend you never saw it? Or will you kneel